I'd like to begin by paying my respects to the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, the true custodians of the land that we're meeting here, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. As a migrant and visitor to this land, I recognize that the sovereignty of this land has never been ceded, and I acknowledge that I live and work on stolen land, and I benefit from its continuing colonization. That recognition, for me, means the commitment to continue my personal and our collective journeys to reconciliation with our First Nation people. I also want to acknowledge my ancestors and the long history of the diverse and rich tapestries of ancestors who've traveled across nations, continents, and oceans in search of a better life. And some of their descendants ended up finding home on this land. When I first heard of Abdul Rahman Abdullah's work at exhibition at the end of last year and the invitation to respond to his work, I was instantly struck by the imagery and the themes. They kind of rustled something really deep in me, a recognition and a calling. This talk is dedicated to my mother, Bibi, who passed away nearly 4 years ago, and it is an unfolding meditation on my journey of remembering. It is quite uncanny and uncannily timely as we approach the Qingming festival, the tomb sweeping day for a lot of Chinese people this Sunday. And during Qingming, which is a really important Chinese tradition practiced over 2,500 years, many Chinese families would visit the tombs of their ancestors to clean the grave sites and to make ritual offerings. April 22nd will be the 4th anniversary of my mother's passing, a woman who's had such a profound impact and presence in my life. And realizing that nearly 2 decades after embarking on my PhD, which was inspired by my mother and her life, I am still unpacking the mysteries of who she was. Abdul Rahman's extraordinary work in this gallery has given me an opportunity to return to her for the first time in this way since her passing. I find myself returning again and again to discover and unearth her from the recesses of my memory, to get to know her, and in that process to know myself, my history, my lineage, and my very entangled and evolving selves. My mother was born on the 6th of May in 1943 in a small town called Simbaling in Kedah, a northern state in West Malaysia. She was the youngest of 7 children and was given the name Chimoy, which means 7th daughter. At 10 months old, she was given away. She was given away to a very poor family in the same village who wanted a wife for one of their sons. She was physically and emotionally abused as a child, and she ran away as soon as she was old enough, at 13, because she had to wait till she was 12 when she got her identity card. In the process of writing my mother's life, I uncovered the mysteries of her birth and the unexplained circumstances which led to her being given away as a baby. I discovered that she was conceived after my grandmother was raped by Japanese soldiers during the Second World War, and my grandfather forced her to give up the child. My mother grew up with the kinds of trauma that seeps deep and through the umbilical cords in ways that I'm still trying to understand. And this was one of her recollections when she was 5 years old, after she was being physically beaten with a wooden plank. She ran into the jungle at the back of the house, and it was raining. As a young child, the injustices that my mother had suffered and endured were told to me as stories of my mother's childhood. And I grew up with the stories feeling deeply troubled and affected by the injustices and the cruelty that she's experienced. And I think that was how probably my first sense of justice, how it was born as a little girl. My mother is a formidable force in all our lives. She was the matriarch of my world. She would always lament to us tales upon tales of a sad and bitter childhood until we all know them like the backs of our hands, till we carry the weight of a heavy past on our backs, consciously and unconsciously. It was as if she sacrificed her life for us, and every tear that she shed carried a price tag with it, a kind of lifelong debt that we all bear, being born to her. Growing up, I remember my mom as a bitterly angry and quite depressed woman. She would cry a lot, and every tear that she shed came down upon us like ton of bricks until we learned to ignore it, switch off from it, brush it off with a "here she goes again." But no matter how we tried to resist, it has already been imprinted in our psyche. This was a photograph taken when I was about 3 years old. It was taken outside the famous Snake Temple in Penang. I'm holding my mother's hand, looking straight into the camera. My mother, who stands very tall next to me, in high platform heels, smiles at the camera. She's standing at a slight angle towards me. She looks happy and relaxed. This is such a rare sight of my mother. The little girl in the photograph dressed in a pretty Korean dress that my mother had bought in her trip to Korea the year before. My hair is tied in 2 plaits and I have comfortable sandals on. And I have this amazing smile on my face, a look that speaks of cheekiness, bold innocence, and pure delight. It is a look that comes from a child who isn't afraid to speak her mind freely and boldly, and a child who is free to be herself. I imagine my papa behind the camera, and I'm smiling at him with that look. Am I seeing myself through his eyes as a daughter he loves just the way she is? Am I seeing myself through my mother's eyes, the child she loves and holds safe in her arms? And this was one of the last photographs of me just the way I was. As a storyteller, I've always been interested in how stories shape our lives and how our lives are shaped by the stories we tell. For as long as I can remember, my mother has always told us the story of how she came into the world. She was a beautiful heavenly deity who lived in the heavenly realms. And one fateful day, being the cheeky deity, she stole the forbidden heavenly peach. And as punishment, the heavenly gods banished her and sent her down to earth to be reborn as a human being into a life of suffering. She wept and she begged the gods for forgiveness, but it was too late. And as she was taken away, she called out to Guan Yin, the goddess of mercy, and begged her for help. Guan Yin touched her hand and told her, "I cannot change your fate, but do not worry, my child. I will watch over you and make sure that you will always have enough to eat and clothe." This story of how my mother, a heavenly deity, was reborn into the life of a woman destined for suffering became one of the most powerful stories I grew up with. My mother's life is what many people would describe as a hard life. In writing her life and my own, the themes of tragedy constantly threatened to invade my writings. My mother's life could very easily be written and told as a life of tragedies. And as a child, I've always thought of my mother's life as tragic, perhaps because she has always spoken of her life in that light. And as a child, I've learned, bearing witness to my mother's life, that there is something honorable about suffering, particularly suffering for your family. And the ideology of suffering and sacrificing for the family sits within the popularized Confucian ideology that underpins the Chinese culture and many Chinese families. And as a young child who idolizes her goddess-like mother, I saw a woman who sacrificed herself for her love and her hope in her husband and her children. And it was the kind of sacrifice so great that it could survive decades of repeated acts of betrayal, disappointment, and humiliation. Unbeknown to me, my mother's selflessness and self-sacrifice were to become my own unconscious maps in life, where the same plots and cycles of selflessness, sacrifice, and betrayal were played out. For a long time, it seemed that there was no other way of seeing or telling her life, but seeing her life but tragic. It is kind like a betrayal, feels like a betrayal to her to imagine her life as something other than that. While her lived experience of suffering were real, what I discovered in writing her life through a feminist narrative lens were the hidden and silent narratives that brought new shapes, new light, and new understanding. The evolving canvas of her life opened up the possibility of storing her life beyond the tragedies into an extraordinary, messy, complex, and legendary life that defies closure. So 20 years after I first put her story to paper, I returned to continue breathing new life into her story and in turn into mine. For as long as we could remember, my mother had always been preparing for her death. At the age of 64, my mother purchased the land title for a double plot of resting place at the prestigious cemetery in Johor Bahru. Her then unmarked marble slab grave sat at the Perpetual Memorial Park in Kulai. It was a site specially designed to employ all the geomancy elements of feng shui, where the energies of mountains, water, earth, and sky would reap fruits into the afterlife. She had her future all planned out, one foot in a grave, while the rest of her remained bound by the umbilical of life that kept her alive and in hope. It was a strangely familiar experience when it came to finally putting her to rest. It was like she had been rehearsing that moment and that ritual with us for decades, but none of it cushioned us from the deep shock and grief of losing her. From the time I was about 3 years old, I was aware of tiny little people with wings, friendly and inviting. Then there were the dead people, walking around like normal people. I could see them, but nobody else seems to be able to. They had a kind of weightlessness about them as they moved, which made them different. I wasn't afraid of them as a child. I simply accepted their presence there with the innocent curiosity of a child. I told my mother about what I saw, and she became convinced that I was possessed. And the fact that I used to frequently sleepwalk didn't help. She had to lock the bedroom door so that I couldn't get out during my sleepwalking. She believed that the evil spirits were luring me in my sleep. And there began a long series of rituals of cleansing by my mother to rid me of the spirits. Unfortunately, my strange encounters played right into my mother's obsessions with the supernatural. I tried explaining to her that not all of them were bad or scary, but it was too late. I had to wear a chain around my neck with 6 or 7 pendants on it, each of them symbolizing a deity that would protect me from the evil spirits. I had another chain around my waist that was made up of thin rope with 9 square sheets of metal inscribed with prayer words, rolled up and inserted into rubber tubes. I had to wear them all the time, even at night and in the shower. Very soon, I stopped remembering what I saw, but I still had to continue wearing all of my protections. And I realized very early that I was somewhat different, and what I saw and experienced wasn't normal. And freaking my mother out was not at all fun, and having to wear all the chains and being subjected to the endless rituals of cleansing were not my idea of fun either. And when I started kindergarten, I began to feel more self-conscious of the things I had to wear because they would bounce and dangle uncomfortably as I played and ran around. I fought hard and long to stop wearing them, but my mother would not back down. The chain around my waist started to go missing, and eventually, after replacing it a number of times, my mother gave up. But I still had to wear the chain around my neck. Soon the pendants slowly start going missing too. And there were less and less of them, and eventually there was one left. And I thought that was a fair compromise. My Malaysian Chinese family's faith was primarily a mix of traditional beliefs, elements of Buddhism and Taoism, and superstition. Growing up, my parents, like many Chinese families in Malaysia, practiced the many rituals passed from many generations ago, and they did it more out of fear than faith. Sticks of incense were burned in the mornings and evening at altars of shrines and deities every day. And at various special dates, numerous elaborate rituals were performed to appease the gods and the ghosts who would protect the family from harm and bring fortune and good luck to the family blessed. And as a child, I watched with great curiosity these rituals and stories of spirits, ghosts, deities, and gods, all seemingly at war with one another. I was both enchanted and scared by it all. My mother was a channeler of Guan Yin, the goddess of mercy, and strangers would come to our house for help. My mother would go into a trance and battle with the spirits that had possessed the bodies of these people. My mother, in her white gown, with her face fixed in a trance-like mask, would dance and move like a graceful but ferocious animal around the man or woman possessed. And I remember a particular incident when I was about 5 years old, when one late evening, a distraught Eng Sing So, who was an old friend of my mother, came to our house looking really tired and pale. She was the skinniest person I've ever known, barely a brown layer of skin around her bones. My mother immediately went into a trance. It was a long battle as the goddess of mercy, the deity channeled by my mother, tried to rid Eng Sing So of an old stubborn spirit who had lived in her for many years, causing her many discomforts, illnesses, and chaos. I hid in the corner of the living room, watching the fight between Guan Yin and this naughty spirit was living in her body, trying to get out but couldn't. And as Guan Yin spun the burning incense in fierce circular motion around Eng Sing So, she yelled out in pain. This went on for many hours until Eng Sing So was about to pass out. The spirit remained in her for many years, and according to my mother, the spirit was gradually weakened by my mother's prayer water that Eng Sing So faithfully drank, and eventually it disappeared. Eng Sing So remained one of my mother's closest and most loyal friends. As a feminist scholar, I've always been fascinated with and rediscovering ancient female mythologies from different cultures. And I began rereading the mythology of Guan Yin, the goddess of mercy. The origin of the Guan Yin came from the story of Miao San, who lived in about 700 BC. She was the third daughter of Bao Ying, the ruler of Chang'an. According to the legend, at the birth of the princess Mao San, the heavens shook, flowers fell, and the air filled with fragrance. A special being was being born. Unfortunately, she was the third daughter of a king and queen who wanted a son, so she was a disappointment. When she came of age, Miao San's parents demanded that she marry so they could have a son-in-law to rule the kingdom. But she refused, insisting that she would follow a spiritual path. Enraged, her father assigned her to the lowliest chores at the palace, hoping to humiliate her into marriage. The queen pleaded with the king to send Mao San to the nunnery. The king did send the girl, secretly instructing the hardest work to be assigned to her. And as Miao San labored, beings from the heaven came to help her. And when the king learned that the princess still refused to relent and marry, he became so angry that he commanded his army to burn down the nunnery. But once again, his efforts were thwarted. Heavenly rain came to put out the fire. At his wits' end, the king ordered that Miao San be taken to the public square and beheaded. With the help of a heavenly being, she managed to escape into a mountain where she began to meditate and pursue her spiritual training for 9 years. Having accumulated terrible karma during his cruel reign, the king became ill and no one could cure him. A mysterious monk appeared at the palace to tell him, "If you can find a person who is without anger, ask them to give you their arms and their eyes, out of which the cook will make medicine to cure you." The king did not believe that such a person existed. But the monk insisted that there is someone without anger, and she's on a nearby mountain. So the desperate king sends a messenger to find this mysterious person. When she was found, Miao San gave up both her arms and both her eyes to cure her father. The king and the queen went to the mountain to thank this savior. When they saw her, they were shocked to recognize this mutilated woman as their daughter. Horrified and remorseful, the king finally recognized the cruelty of his persecution of Miao San. When the king confessed how ill-deserving he was of a sacrifice, Miao San replied, "Having given up this human eyes, I shall see with diamond eyes. Having yielded up these mortal arms, I shall receive golden arms." And at those words, Miao San transformed into the 1,000-armed, 1,000-eyed Guan Yin. She rose up and hovered over above her parents and ascended to heaven. The legend of Miao San, immortalized as the goddess of mercy and compassion, epitomizes the independent female spirit who chooses a life of spiritual devotion and challenges the conventions of female obligations. What's interesting and ironical is how this feminist figure has been popularized and adopted in many Southeast Asian countries as a deity that people pray to for sons. In returning to and reclaiming this powerful female goddess in mythology, I came to understand why and how she was so central to my mother's life. I'm going to play this video of my mother channeling Guan Yin in one of the largest festivals in my hometown in 1985. It was quite a miracle that I chanced upon this video just a couple of years ago. My mother is one of the most intelligent women I have ever known. She has an extraordinarily brilliant mind. And with such a brilliant and powerful mind, to not be given the opportunity to go to school, to be trapped in her era and her life, she found her own language and expression in the world of the supernatural. She found her superpowers. The world of the supernatural gave her a powerful outlet and a way to express and channel her power, her voice, and her agency. In my work with traumatized bodies, I now have a completely different insight into how my mother responded to her own traumas. In an era where there were no professional help, no family support, facing a cruel and judgmental world, she had to find a way to exist. Her relationship with the supernatural not only saved her life and her sanity, it was also a way she could express and embody her power. And she was an extraordinarily powerful woman. Her faith in Kuan Yin was steadfast and unshakable throughout her entire life. Her embodiment as the channeler of Kuan Yin and a spiritual healer provided deep spiritual, mental, emotional, and bodily healing. And I remember the story she would tell about how each time she channeled Kuan Yin, her body felt cleansed and healed. The performance of rituals of bodily and spiritual cleansing were extraordinary to witness as a child. And now, so many years later, they become doorways to completely different ways of understanding her and how she's managed to reclaim a life for herself. I love Abdul Rahman Abdullah's meditation. Nothing is true, but everything is permitted. I read this meditation as a gesture that as human beings, we often find imaginative, creative, and resourceful ways out of impossible situations. The human spirit is ferocious, and the primal urge to survive and to thrive under extremely difficult conditions is enduring. What cannot be resolved and processed during our waking hours, we reach into the underworlds of dreams, imaginations, ghosts, and spirits. My mother found her way. She connected with the supernatural world in order to cope with the senseless world that she lived in. One makes the other more tolerable, more endurable. She was able to traverse between the two parallel worlds and build a home for herself and her family, raise 5 children, and touch so many people's lives. As the first-generation Malaysian-born Chinese-Australian migrant woman, daughter and mother, my writings represent the complex negotiation of identities, bodies, familial relationships across generational, geographical, spatial, and temporal boundaries. Like so many first-generation Chinese living in Australia, I made regular trips back to my homeland to rediscover old and familiar landscapes, foods, and languages. And the umbilical cord that links me to my homeland and my home womb travels with me as I journey to new homes to reconnect and re-script my relationship with stories, food, mother tongues, and memory, for myself and for my children. Australian writer and scholar Su Ming Teo writes about the phantom presence that haunts writers in contemporary Australia in their attempts to communicate within and across cultures. Cross-cultural communication is haunted by phantom limbs in all sorts of ways. The phantom limbs of the reverent white nation, the phantom limbs of the various cultures migrants left behind, and the phantom limbs of home, of landscapes which ache in all places of departure. So 2 decades after first embarking on writing, I returned to these memories and stories with renewed understanding that allowed me to continue to reimagine, play, and write against, alongside, and beyond this phantom presence. For me, the entanglements of memory, history, and imagination continues to unfold in ways that not only defies closure, but are constantly opening and becoming. Since my mother's passing, I've created my own altar for her in my home. It has a framed photo of her. This was her favorite photo, one that had been proudly displayed in the living room in her house for decades. It was a stunningly beautiful photo of her. She was around 36 years old, mother to 5 children, and a moment she remembered as one of the most powerful moments in her life. This photo sits alongside 3 Kuan Yin statues that belong to her. Every morning and evening, I lit a candle for her and for Kuan Yin. But the fact is, in my mind, they are the same. And quite uncannily, I found out this morning when I got a message from my second sister in Malaysia that today is Kuan Yin's birthday, which falls on the 19th day of the 2nd lunar month. I want to end the talk with the rituals and the joys of Mahjong. A famous game advised amongst many Chinese people, a strategic game that was said to have existed from the mid-1800s in China. And I tried to search for the origin of this game, but there were many contested theories. It's said by some to be invented by Confucius, but that was unproven. And my favorite story is the one that I've heard some years ago, that Mahjong was invented by the concubines of the Qing dynasty as a way to entertain themselves. I think I like this theory the best. I have vivid memories of sitting on my father's lap as a toddler while he was playing Mahjong. The loud clanking sounds of the Mahjong tiles hitting and the buzzing sounds of excited and passionate voices echoing late into the night. When I learned to play the game as an adult with a group of Chinese migrant women, which started off as a mother's group, it was a complete thrill. My two young children learned to play alongside me, and we absolutely loved it. And in the last few years of my mother's life, we were able to play Mahjong with her during our annual visits to Malaysia. The memories of playing Mahjong with their popo will be forever imprinted in my children's minds and bodies. To my children, my mother was the funniest and the most endearing, loving and adorable popo. They love her and were loved by her in ways that seeps deep into their beings. Recently, we decided to revive the game and set up a permanent Mahjong table and set in our living room. In playing this ancient game, we brought my mother and their popo back to life. We recall and share stories of her, laugh about her favorite strategies and her hilarious expression in Hokkien. It is as if she is right there with us. In the many diverse and creative ways that we perform the rituals of remembering, we reconnect with the richness of intergenerational connections that runs deep. And one of the most important lessons I've learned is from our First Nation elders, who reminded us that in our work to free ourselves of the intergenerational traumas of our past, we must remember not to unwittingly throw out the intergenerational strengths, wisdoms, and joys that we've inherited. Thank you. Happy to take questions, comments.
I don't know anything about Mahjong. I could go strategy or how
Yeah.
How does it actually work? What's so special about it?
Oh gosh, I'm completely not an expert in this. It is a game of strategy, and I think of the games, and we grew up playing lots of board games and stuff. It's one of the most strategic and most intelligent games around. Very, very popular. It's been popularized in America, in particular, since the 1920s, I think. I think the way I describe it is such a tactile game. And you sit around the table with 4 players, and once you get past once you learn how to play the game, it's the conversations. It's a social, it's deeply, lots of gossip gets shared, lots of complaints get shared. I think it's such a beautiful way to connect. Very tactile, the sounds of Mahjong, it's just it's a really, really fun, very addictive as well. Yeah.
In popular culture too.
It is, yeah.
A big part of that was the Crazy Rich Asians, where mother was
Yes,
quite a significant part of the film.
Yeah. And look, I mean, it is, in a lot of countries in Southeast Asia, it's a proper gambling thing, where money's lost and won, very, very serious. But we just play it like we play Monopoly with plastic money. Even then, it gets quite excitable. Thanks for that question. Right. Mm. Yeah. Yeah. Mm. Mm. Yeah, yeah, no, they're absolutely right, and I sort of do work in the context of my counselling practice with a lot of young people, and how, I mean, I guess in sort of popular psychology we talk about, the invisible friends that children and young people have, and how often those imaginary or real um, friends they have are really such a big part in their sense of security, their companion, people they feel safe with. But as adults, I think we tend to really diminish those experiences and those connections. Yeah, but you're right. I think looking back now, even though the world of the supernatural and religious rituals were very much a big part of the Malaysian Chinese culture, there were also a lot of judgment. I remember growing up, there were, particularly relatives from my dad's side who were a lot more educated. Um, yeah, would definitely judge my mum all of her life for her strange beliefs. So there was still a lot of judgment, but she had that avenue, which was extraordinary. Yeah. Sorry? The I have one. I have one left. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's quite extraordinary. I was a very, very difficult child to handle. Very feisty. Yeah.
Why do you think you stopped seeing?
Oh, yeah. I think I realized very quickly that none of this was good. None of this was, and it was quite a torture as that young kid. I would have to have special rituals every day. I have to, get washed by, special kaffir lime and 7 different flowers, and it's a lot of cleansing, and I had to be scrubbed, with those lime. And it was as a kid, it was not fun. So I think I realized that that's just not a normal thing, and I should just keep it to myself. And I think as kids, we adapt. We're so adaptive, and that was one of my adaptations. I don't see things anymore, but I kind of sense them. So I haven't lost that sort of sixth sense, I guess. Yeah.
Sounds like your mother might have the same thing.
Oh, she had extraordinary sixth sense.
So
Yeah.
you have to do it as well.
Yeah, and that's quite a common thing with, and this is sort of not just unique to, the Malaysian Chinese culture. I think a lot of people who are channelers and mediums and psychic, they exist in all cultures. Interesting how and they often describe it as a responsibility. It's not for everybody. Yeah, could be quite troubling.
Yeah. Blessing, but not
Yeah,
the curse.
that's right. Yeah. Yeah.
Why do you think there has been a lot of shame around more spiritual people being able to have that sixth sense?
Oh, yeah. Look, I think I think because it sort of taps into a lot of things. So I would answer that question in two ways. I think there's definitely with the westernization of a lot of Asian culture, part of that, the whole Enlightenment project and, being rational and, being able to prove things, I think that creeps in. And it's interesting, as I was saying, how my dad's side of the family, they're all very educated, public servants, so they sort of really just look down on this as just completely irrational and, unreal and strange. And I think with the supernatural, I guess there was also that there's a shadow side to it as well, I guess, because it does tap into people's insecurities and fears, and sometimes people can sort of get a bit too far with it. And I think we just there's so much wisdom that we can learn from that, and justice is just one woman's story, and I just wonder how many more to not be able to tap this into this. It changes the whole story. It changes the way I understand how, and I think what Indigenous people have been telling us about healing, Western ways are doing more harm than good, because we're simply not able to understand that there are different ways of healing. And I think understanding my mother's way of dealing with her trauma and how she tapped into the different worlds, gave me an insight that there's so many ways we can understand faith and healing and recovery, and we are very, very limited. It's like we've got this really narrow, boxed-in lens. So I'm not sure if I answer your question. There's a lot of judgment because you can't prove it. You can't prove the supernatural, and my position is, if it means so much, if it's so powerful to someone, if it helps them heal, if they feel cleansed and they feel healed, why do we need proof? Isn't that proof enough? And I think Western, perspective are very limited in that way.
Isn't it interesting how you can have absolute faith in the existence of God with no proof, and that's totally
That's right. So I think the narratives of the conversation we have around faith is very limited, very skewed, very Eurocentric. Yeah. Any other comments?
I just want to say thank you for sharing the story of the resistance within everything that's occurred. That's just such an important part of the story. And I would love to hear more stories told in that way.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. This is the first time I've done anything like this, and it really is as a really quite a provocative, evocative response to Abdul Rahman Abdullah's work. And I haven't had a chance to tell him that, but I will. And so thanks for being my test audience. It feels really right. I was quite nervous about it because I think, this is really left wing. This is quite. But thank you for being here, for me to be able to share that.